does it. Welcome to the night at the John Oxley Library. This is my first, night at the library, so you have to be a little bit patient with me. I'm not quite sure what to expect, but my kids have been watching a night in the museum recently, and that's how I sort of imagined this. It wouldn't be nice to be locked in here, and with all those old characters. At the night of the museum, you get Custer coming out, I think, and a few historical characters, and it's a lot like the library here because we've got all the evidence, the material of a lot of very important Queensland characters and a lot of people who are very interesting Queensland characters who haven't yet been discovered. And that's the great thing, isn't it, about the library, because the evidence for people is all here, and it just takes, people to, as we were talking about before, asking the right question to discover these amazing people. And so libraries are really dynamic places, and that's why I like the idea of being locked in a library for an evening and with all the evidence of all these people yet to be discovered. It's quite fascinating. So the library is really a dynamic place, and so we're here tonight really to explore some of the aspects of the library that I suppose people haven't explored as much in the past as they should, and music especially is one of the aspects of society that and the past that's really important and we haven't really explored so much. I'm Ian Townsend and I'm a journalist with ABC Radio National, and I've also been a John Oxley Library Fellow here doing research on a cyclone 100 years ago. And I'm also a research student in history at the University of Queensland. Our guest tonight, performer, composer, musical director and researcher, Dr Robert Keane, and barrister, debater, singer, songwriter and parodist, John Thompson. What an incredible amount of talent.
It doesn't say I'm good at any of them.
Yeah. I'll get to the histories a little bit more in a moment. And also tonight we've got Robin Hamilton and Laurel Dingle here, who share the Queensland Music Coordinator role at the State Library, and they've found some material that we'll look at a bit closer a bit later. And if you get a moment to speak to them, they've got some great stories to tell. I was speaking to them the other day. It's always interesting speaking to people who work at libraries, and especially libraries that keep archives, because they're constantly finding fascinating material, and unless you ask them what they've found, you just don't know. But when you do, you just realise what a wealth of information and what great stories. As a journalist, I'm really interested in stories. So when you speak to librarians who do the research, you think, oh, I could just keep researching and using some of those stories to tell other people. That's what we look for stories for. So recording of music's obviously changed and over the years, and that's been the challenge, I think, for libraries and for us doing the research. Today my kids walk around the house with music in their ears, and my youngest has a show and tell actually this Friday, and I've managed to find one of my father's old 78 records. It's Indian Love Call, I think. But before 78s, if you wanted music, you had to perform it. You had to perform it yourself, didn't you, or have somebody perform it in front of you. And that made for a pretty dynamic musical landscape. Every house had a piano. My grandmother had a piano in the house in the 70s, and that had been there for 100 years. So that was the centre of, before TV, that was the centre of attention. And so people didn't just listen to music, they were arguably more music literate. So music was a big part of everybody's life then, as it is now, but it's a challenge now to find some of that music and to recreate it. And that's why we're in the John Oxley Library tonight. So Robert Keane's had a long career. He's got a PhD from... from University of London, and he did a lot of research on the composer Sibelius, which is fascinating in itself, and these guys could probably spend several hours talking about their various interests, and we'll try to sort of narrow it down a bit. Robert composed the music for the Waltzing Matilda Centenary some time ago now. Did a lot of music research at the National Library of Australia and here at the State Library of Queensland on songs with Queensland place names, and we'll talk a little bit about that a bit later because there's some great music over there. as well. And in the last 18 months or so, he's been working on the World War I centenary project at the JOL and the Australian War Memorial, on the letters of diggers from the trenches, and the music from that period, which is really important. John Thompson's a former barrister who's taken up music as a career, a second career. What a great...
It's a fairly strong word for it, but yes.
He grew up singing around the family piano, as we talked about earlier, was a member of the St Stephen's Cathedral Choir, a busker, played in a number of bands in the 1980s in Queensland. John sings with Cloud Street with Nicole Murray, who's here. And they play Australian traditional music with original songs and tunes written in the traditional style as well. So hopefully we'll hear some of their work a bit later. And over on the table, as I said, we'll take a look at some of their discoveries. And one of the books over there John was showing me a bit earlier is a collection of Reginald Hurd, his scrapbooks. Now, Reginald Hurd, well, I might ask John, actually, what do you know about Reginald Hurd? Because he was an interesting character, and he just loved collecting things, and one of the things he collected happened to be songs from the Queenslander newspaper magazine.
Well, I'm very, very fortunate to have been speaking to Robin before tonight. She put me out to a little pocket biography of Reginald Hurd. He was a police magistrate who was an avid stamp and shell collector. And it seems that when he retired, he not only kept up his interest in current affairs, but if you look through his cuttings books, which form what some people call the Hurd collection, he seemed to collect items of historical and contemporary interest almost at random. And amongst them, he clipped and collected a bunch of songs that were published in the supplement to the Brisbane Courier, which was a weekly publication called the Queenslander. In one of the columns, Flotsam and Jetsam, the author of that column asked people to send in what were considered then, and this is 1894, 1895, old bush songs. And so people sent them in a couple of times. The person who was administering the column had to print a little note insisting that they be songs, not poems, and old, not ones that you've written.
So how could he tell? How could you tell that it was a song and not a poem? Was there a suggestion of the music to go with them?
Occasionally people would indicate what they knew of the origin of the song. Perhaps 2/3 of the songs that were eventually published have an indicated melody. It'll say Air, Villikins and his Diner, for example, something like that. Some of the songs aren't well known, but you can sometimes track them down. Others simply have no melody. You can occasionally pick the melody from the way the song scans. Well,
I might ask you about that a bit later, because that's a really interesting way of approaching music, that sort of reverse engineering of words to music, and how you go about doing that. But what's the importance of these old songs to you? What do you get from them?
Well, my central musical interest is in what's referred to invariably as folk or traditional music. Now, in Australia, that's a bit of a mixed beast, but folk music is the music that a particular community, in this case Australia in the late 19th century, considers to be their music. It's never fixed in time. The music of a community that has live music as part of its culture varies. There'll be songs that they think are old. There'll be an interesting parody of an old song that someone's written. There'll be traditional music that someone brought from England or Ireland into that community. For whatever period of time, that music becomes that group's music. I have an interest in the way that these old songs, whether they be songs that were authentically written around a bushfire by a campfire by someone that had some musical talent, turns into his depiction of what was going on in his life or current events of the time, and how that then becomes picked up by others, and then over time develops into something that the Australian community in the 1930s thought of as one of our songs.
So can you trace the lineage, the genealogy of some of these
Almost
songs?
Never. Right. Especially if you're talking about traditional music, because there is a school of thought that says a song is no longer a folk song as soon as you write it down. And because the songs change as they're transmitted through generations and from group to group. So it's really common with tunes, especially traditional tunes. If you have a traditional tune from Ireland that's been played in Australia for 100 years, and you might hear it at sessions and you play along with it on whatever instrument you play, and you know that tune. When you go to Ireland and hear that tune, you may well struggle to recognise it. Halfway through you'll go, oh, I know this. But you don't, because it's been played in Australia in a different way.
Any songs spring to mind?
Auguthella Station, the Queensland Ladies, Farewell and Adieu to You Brisbane Ladies, Farewell and Adieu to You Girls of Toowong. The English thought it was hilarious that song existed when we went over there, because of course it's Farewell and Adieu, you true British sailors.
Right.
And who are these Brisbane ladies? What's a Brisbane?
So songs evolved, but did they? At one point in our history, did they stop evolving when we started writing them down as a matter of course?
Not really. Robert, you pointed out to me before that wonderful photograph of the letter that someone had written with the words to Tipperary. It's a long way to Tipperary, and how we know through various printed versions that he got the words wrong. But that doesn't mean that wasn't the way Tipperary was sung where he was.
It's interesting that it's actually got 3 verses.
Yeah.
I mean, we all know Tipperary, but I didn't know it had 1 verse, but it's got 3.
So Robert's found a letter in the library here that includes all 3 verses to It's a Long Way to Tipperary. And it was, well, maybe you explain who might have written it and when and what it says.
I'm not sure the library even knows because I've asked Simon, but I was researching photographs from World War I in the collection, of which there are many, many, many thousands. And in a box I came across these photographs, and there were photographs of a letter from approximately 1915, and they are the words which were sent home to somebody, which are the words of the song Tipperary. Now, Tipperary was written in about 1914 as a result of some kind of a bet in England by a couple of music hall guys, and it became an overnight hit. And obviously the Aussies, who when they finally in 1916 got to the UK, post-Gallipoli, learned the song from the Pommies, from the Tommies, and from the bands. It was very, very popular. It became an instant hit. And the interesting thing was that it has these 3 verses. And I discovered the photographs of the letter with this chap writing them home to his family and misquoting, getting the words wrong because they're words that he didn't like. For example, the first verse says, "Up to mighty London came an Irishman one day. All the streets were paved with gold. Sure, everyone was gay. Singing songs of Piccadilly," it says in the text, "standing lest, L-E-S-T, the square." But it's actually Strand and Leicester Square. But he didn't know what Leicester Square was, so it sounded to him like Lest the Square. And then the verse, and basically all the verses are bad Irish jokes. He says in the second one, Paddy wrote a letter to his Irish Molly O, saying, "If you don't receive it, will you write and let me know? If I make mistakes in spelling, Molly dear," said he, "remember it's the pen that's bad, don't put the blame on me." So it's a long way to Tipperary. And these are the silly sorts of things. So the interesting thing is that, we think we know that song, and we don't. And what's currently thought is that the song perhaps doesn't even refer to the typical Irish town of Piccadilly, but refers to a red light district somewhere in England, which was referred to as Piccadilly. And the sweetest girl I know is right there. So these things change, and they become currency.
And people adopt them for their own, and perhaps they evolve over time as well. It's not just the material you're interested in, though, John, is it? You look for the letters. You're looking for inspiration for some of the music that you do.
Yeah, well, if it's a project, for example, when we did the Queensland 150th anniversary, we were looking at songs about Queensland, and it so turned out that there are about 150 songs there's a song about Maryborough, there's a song about Bundaberg, there's a song about Ipswich, there's one about Coolangatta. I mean, there's songs about Charters Towers. There's even one about Townsville, which I was disgusted to find out I wrote myself when I was 16.
Townsville, the flower of the north.
Oh, awful, dreadful piece. But so it comes about. And these marvellous documents, and you see a lot of them over on the table, exist today, and we're able to research them because I suspect at the time of Federation, I think the girls know about this, the government passed the law which was called legal deposit, a regulation, which meant that all publishers within Australia had to submit one copy of every publication, one to their state library and one to the National Library. That regulation still exists today. When I started my publishing company in 1994, I had to send a copy of everything, one to the State Library, one to National Library, and so on. So some of these wonderful honky songs are there. And talking about, John, how things change, one of the things which you'll see on there on the table is called Beautiful, Beautiful Queensland. And it was written in 1933 by W. Lee Daniel, who was, in fact, the head of the state of Texas in the United States, and he wrote it as beautiful, beautiful Texas, down where the green grasses grow. And somebody from Queensland heard it and said, that's a wonderful song, I wish we could have that one. And so they paid somebody to change the words. They were beautiful, and Tex Morton recorded it, beautiful, beautiful Queensland, down where the blue grasses grow. So it's sitting over there on the table, and you can have a look at it. So, but it came from Texas, you see, nobody knew the difference. And when you hear Tex Morton sing it, they've got the recording at the National Film and Sound Archive in Canberra, and you never ever suspect that it's actually an American song. We were mentioning before how much there's another song over there which I may be persuaded to perform in a few minutes.
You will.
Unfortunately, I didn't bring my piano with me, but I just happen to have a copy of the words here. And it's a wonderful song called Down on the Sands at Emu Park. Now, do you know where Emu Park is? Ladies and gentlemen, when God created the world, with the bits that he had left over, he made Australia. With the bits he had left over from that, he made Queensland. With the bits he had left over from that, he made Rockhampton. Oh. And with the bits he had left over from that, he made Emu Park. Yes. So it's not the sort of place you'd expect the song to be written about. But what we were saying, the chorus says, why sing of Mississippi and my old Kentucky home and places far away from us where lovers often roam? Why the American references? Because at that time, popular music was American music. And the songs that you sang in the parlour were away down upon the Swanee River and my old Kentucky home. So those things show up. So I'll just give you a quick burst of this.
That'd be great.
Right,
yes, might as well do it now. Yeah.
Down on the sands at Emu Park, strolling along the beach, watching the tide as it ebbs and flows as far as the eye can reach, watching the seagulls gliding by over the briny foam, there with the girl that I love best, that's where I love to roam. Why sing of Mississippi and my old Kentucky home, and places far away from us where lovers often roam? Just give to me the girl I love, the gum and the iron bark, and a cosy corner on the beach down at Emu Park.
Oh, here it comes.
And so it goes on. There's one more verse, but I won't trouble you with that. So the point is that these kind of songs are part of the currency. It's part of the culture. It's part of the life. And they still are. And I suspect to a lesser extent now when I hear songs on the radio like Let's Chop Up Grandmother with a Meat Axe. I wonder whether that would be such a cultural gem as Down on the Sands at Emu Park. I don't know. John's probably found more interesting songs than that.
But Robert, just on the connection with what we were saying before, the Tipperary. I think it's 1912, but it was a music hall song.
Yeah.
It'd be very hard to argue that it didn't become a folk song of the diggers and the army, English-speaking armies generally. But when it was first produced, it didn't have any of the characteristics of a song belonging to a community. It just became not just popular, but popular at a time when singing songs in groups and to each other was an inherent part of the culture.
So it's a song for the time, and that's the thing about songs, isn't it? And the emotional value of them is that they take you to that particular time later on.
Yeah, and
it's a marching song too. That's the other thing. And like Pack Up Your Troubles in Your Old Kit Bag. Yeah. We did a thing here a couple of years ago for the Queensland Conservative in Griffith, over at the whatnot there, and it was called connections, and it was about China. And there was a big dinner on at the hotel there. And at the start of the dinner, we had 10 young singers from the conservatorium. And so we're singing about China, so they wanted to sort of warm up the audience, kind of an act before the whole thing begun. So I had been to Beijing with a tour group some years ago, and I had deconstructed some songs. It's a long way to Beijing, China. It's a long way to go. It's a long way to... But you've gone and spent your dough. Goodbye, Brisbane City. Farewell, King George Square. It's a long, long way to Beijing, China, but my heart's right there. So I said to these young singers from the conservatoire, well, this is easy. You side sing that to Tipperary, and then pack up your troubles. I had practice your chopsticks for the old Great Wall and smile, boy, smile. And these young people who were in their 20s said to me, but we don't know those songs. We don't know Tipperary, and we don't know Pack Up Your Troubles. It seems inconceivable. But that's how it... And I literally had to teach them, admittedly with the wrong words, but teach them the two songs. And you see, they do kind of go together, and that was the thing. You get Group A singing one, Group B the other, and then you put everybody together. And then everybody has a good time, and they drink more wine, and the function becomes a much greater success, you see.
But that's such a continuation of another tradition, the whole thing of parody. So many of the World War I songs, the little snippets of songs that the soldiers wrote themselves, are tremendously inappropriate parodies. I think one of the gentler ones is "That's the Wrong Way to Tickle Mary." We are the
King George's soldiers, yes, the ragtime army.
Well, John, you've been at the library tasting a lot of the songs that you've been finding in the Queenslander. So you look for, what do you look for when you look for a song that you might be able to, or you think you might be able to resurrect?
Well, looking through the Queenslander is part of a particular project that I'm interested in. I'm not so much filtering those songs, because there's 63, I think, that were published in the Queenslander. But generally, I look for songs that have some edge to them that a contemporary audience can connect to, or alternatively, a song that you can put into a contemporary context. It's why I have a lot of difficulty translating some of the World War I material into performance, because musically it's such a dated style of music, or alternatively it reflects the incredible patriotism that was expressed in the songs of the early years of the war. This is all going to be fantastic. Let's go. The song that I've been singing a little of is "Be a Man, Enlist Today," and it's all about once more your mother is calling. We won't leave a friend without an answer. We will go and defend England, which often in these songs is sung with 3 syllables for the sake of the line. It's England.
And there's a lot of sheet music over there related to World War. And I imagine a lot of that was written at the very start of the war. Did the music change? Do you find patriotic songs, or the songs as patriotic as the war progressed?
Well, there's that saying that the victor gets to write the history. I think the ordinary soldier's songs will. If you put a group of 100 random 20-year-olds together today, they're going to have different interests in music. If you ask them to produce a song from their interests that they all share, well, it's going to be something fairly middle of the road. The music that survives will survive because either it was immensely popular, or it was preserved intentionally, or it was preserved through what we call the folk process, where it's passed on through people, inevitably changing along the way. Things like Tipperary would not have been as widespread throughout the military if it hadn't been such a popular song at the time. I mean, the fact that it refers to Tipperary being a long way away is, I think, pure chance. That's just, it was written as an Irishman missing things. So you've got that distance. That's written 2 years before the war, and then it just latches on to what's on people's minds. People are going away. The other song that written in response to the war is Keep the Home Fires Burning. And one of the interesting things for me about these songs, I learnt a lot of these songs from my mum. She learnt them from her mum. They were World War II songs, not World War I songs. And then you have songs sung in World War I like Hurrah for the Scarlet and the Blue, which was a Boer War recruiting song, which they sang, well, next time they had a war, we'll sing the recruiting song. So they sang the one from the Boer War at the beginning of World War I. So
And they're co-opting songs that are popular and then reinterpreting them for their...
Oh, of course, but it happens. It happens immensely. What's the Eric Bogle song, Willie McBride?
Yeah.
It mentions 1916 or 1915, depending on who's singing it. I heard it sung in Ireland and was talking to someone about it, and he was insisting that it was a traditional song written about the Easter Uprising, because it's about a man dying in 1916. So,
Yes,
and I'm saying, well, no, it was written by a Scottish accountant who I know, and he wrote it in Australia.
Isn't that incredible? Well, and I've actually been researching myself recently World War II, and
Getting in early? Oh.
we're looking at Rabaul, but I've been looking at the battalion band of the 222nd in Rabaul in 1942 was a Salvation Army band recruited from different Salvation Army bands in Melbourne, but their leader was Arthur Gullidge, who was a well-known music writer at the time and wrote a lot of marching music, and it's still being used today in the military. But they co-opted The Wizard of Oz for their main marching tune. So when they marched off to war, they marched to The Wizard of Oz, which had come out a few years earlier. But
what lyrics did they use?
Well, they didn't sing it; they marched to it. So
Okay.
they interpreted it for a brass band.
That's wonderful.
And the other,
It's very jaunty, though, to me.
it is, yeah. But you can imagine, can't you?
Oh, yeah.
It works.
The Tipperary seems to be more than just a song, because it was adopted very quickly by pretty well everybody. There's a document here in amongst the zillions of things that I was researching, a letter, and it's dated. Something like the 20th of July, 1915, Gallipoli. So a young man writing home to his family. And he said, we were going up to the ridge and we got cut off because some Turkish crossfire. And we fell in with a group of New Zealanders. So we hid with them under some bushes, in a bit of a ridge there for a while till we could get safe. And later on in the afternoon, we had our chance to get our own back because we came across a group of Czechs and we were able to charge them. And it says, the date is July 1915, it says, our boys are cool. Some of them started singing Tipperary while they were charging the Turks. Our boys are cool. You think that's a modern word? 1915 they were using it. And they were singing, can you imagine? It's a long way, while they were charging the Turks. So it became a rallying song because it's got that march rhythm which is so fundamental.
Yes.
And it somehow represents the pulse and the heartbeat and the walking and the marching which they did, and they marched they sang all the way. Some of them in France from one place to 20 miles away. They never stopped singing the whole way. It's also a rallying thing. It makes them feel better and all that kind of stuff. So I think Tipperary just had those magical ingredients. Curiously enough, the verses I never knew those verses existed.
No.
I only knew and the third verse, which is even sillier. I mean, the three verses are music hall Irish jokes. That's basically it shows the origin in the music hall.
The use of music for especially for soldiers, it was used. Well, it was a lot of singing, a lot of, and they all had bands, didn't they? So they really co-opted music. And it would have helped them at the time, and obviously the women folk back home would have been listening. I'm just trying to imagine perhaps a mother in Toowong with a gramophone, and the boys are off at the war. What would she have played in 1916 That would have been evocative.
She wouldn't play Tipperary. She'd have had My Old Kentucky Home and way down on the Swanee River and that, because there wasn't a lot of Australian music per se. These compositions over there on the table, things like Cooey, Cooey, You're Wanted at the Dardanelles, which are not distinguished other than for their very jingoistic, imperialistic
It does
lyrics.
sound like an answering machine message.
Yes, I know. Think of our boys at the front, things like that. And there are many of them. Some of them actually, some I've researched from here, that were commissioned by the Queensland Recruiting Committee and written by some bloke from Toowoomba who seems to be able to write a song about anything. If you wanted a song about anvils, he would knock out one. If you wanted one about Toowoomba, he could do one. If you wanted one about swimming in the Brisbane River, he could do that.
Were they any good at all?
And it didn't seem to,
Were they any good?
No, they're all rubbish. Right. I mean, the point is they're only rubbish in the sense that by what we compare them to. But at the time, and who would have sung them? A lot of them on the covers you'll see, as sung by Miss Molly McGregor in the so-and-so show at Melbourne. Remember Sawleys and all those kind of things? This was long before movies were around, but they weren't very common. And so people went to these variety shows, and Miss Molly Smith would come out and sing, as part of the war effort, Cooey, Cooey, You Wanted at the Dardanelles.
And that's how they knew. And so, but that suggestion was how they knew what tune to sing it to.
Yeah, well, whoever had written it had done it. The sensational success as sung by Miss Molly Smith. And so the printing of sheet music, and some of those ABC price 1 shilling, 1 and 6, 2 shilling. The music was still, there was a big market for print music because there were still pianos in homes, and that's how people entertained themselves. So print music died about 1970, around about then, when pianos were thrown out by the millions. I understand there are some 2,000 to 3,000 pianos per day being dumped in the United States because nobody wants them.
What today?
And they can't be repaired, or they're too expensive to repair, so they go to landfill. But it was the iPad of its day. Everybody had one.
John, you mentioned before that with the Queenslander, you're looking at the words and trying to then interpret what the music might have been. How do you go about doing that? Are there clues with it, like a code?
Sometimes the words will suggest a tune, but where that's not the case, you do your best. You try to write a tune that doesn't get in the way of the lyrics, because with folk music, narrative music, it's all about the story that the song has to tell. I've been around the traditional music scene since about 1982, and like any other sort of music, it has its conventions, it has its recognisable patterns. So you subconsciously apply some of those, occasionally consciously do it.
It's a bit of detective work and instinct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you'll try to write a tune that sounds right with the aim of getting the song across.
And there were some great performers and writers, weren't there, in Queensland in the late 1890s. It's just a matter of finding them, but Charles Augustus Flower is a man who springs to mind. Tell me about him.
Charles Flower, the John Oxley has his papers in its collection, and I didn't realise that the song, and I'll sing you a little bit of it, the song's called The Broken Down Squatter, and Charles Augustus Flower was quite a wealthy man who lived up on the Darling Downs with his brother Horatio. I have no idea where they got these names, but Charles Augustus Flower is a wonderful name, and of course his brother would have to be called Horatio. Their interests weren't particularly affected by the depression of the 1890s. He remained wealthy, but he wrote this song about the experience of the people that he was seeing around him going through these drastically bad financial times. I had a little bit of a look around for some detail of that today because I didn't have a clear sense of the depression of the 1890s. By some reckonings, the 1929 Great Depression saw Australia's GDP shrink by about 7%. Between 1890 and 1894, the Australian GDP shrank by 17%, 12.5% in 1 year. So it was a massive constriction of the Australian economy. And so hundreds and hundreds of people were losing their properties. It was several banks closed. I think it was over 10 banks closed in Victoria. I know that one of the Australian banks that closed was the Federal Bank of Australia, and I like to think that it probably shut down because it predated Federation by nearly 10 years, so it didn't have much success. But Charles Augustus Flower wrote this.
Great.
I'll just sing you a verse next for it.
So what's this song called?
It's called The Broken Down Squatter, and I learnt it in Brisbane through someone singing it at a folk music session, and I'll just move that because I don't want it to be too loud.
Yep.
Come, stumpy old man, we must shift while we can. Your mates in the paddock are dead. Let us bid our farewells to Glen Eden's sweet dells and the place where your lordship was bred. Together to roam from our drought-stricken home, it's hard that such things have to be, and it's hard on a horse to have naught for a boss than a broken down squatter like me. And the banks are all broken, they say, the merchants are all off a tree. When the big wigs are brought to the bankruptcy court, what chance a poor squatter like me?
Very good. You mentioned you look for songs, John, that have some resonance today. There's obviously a lot in that particular song, and is that one of the reasons why it survived, because it is still played, isn't it?
Oh yeah, that song's, it's not uncommon to hear that sung in the rare places where people get together and sing traditional Australian music.
And we're talking about banks going broke, and we're talking about government aid and farms being repossessed.
Yeah, well, we had, it was just after the
droughts.
The Bank of Scotland went broke. Then Nicole and I were doing a tour, and we were playing in Scotland, and we got to introduce the song by saying, I'm not sure if you can imagine this, but imagine a time when people speculate wildly on increasing real estate values, and it all goes bad, and even a bank is forced to shut down. And it's hard to imagine that such a thing could happen today, but that's what this song is about.
Well, we might take some questions if you like. There's quite a bit we can talk about, but does anybody have a question now for John or Robert about their research or? Yeah, sorry. Yes, we've got a microphone, a roving microphone. I have been warned to tell you about this, so
we'll take that as a comment.
Yep.
In 100 years' time, when we look back to the next presentation, how will music be, with no sheet music, how will the history of the Australian songs be retained?
Well, I mean, there still is music. I mean, it hasn't ceased to exist. I was interested to see recently that the great orchestra in Holland, the Concertina, has embraced the digital age, where the musicians now they don't have music on their music stands. They all have a A4, A5 size iPad, which has some 2,000 or 3,000 orchestral works on it. So all the violas have an iPad, and all their music is on. It's been stored digitally, so it's there. I've seen, actually, when I was teaching at Nudgee 2 years ago, we had a singing teacher. He's subsequently gone on to do something else, and he had all his music on his iPad, and when he wanted to turn the page, he touched that and the page would flip it. So it's still there. It's just going to be distributed in a different format, I think. My concern is that, and it has always been probably because I was raised as a composer, and from an age when there were people who, like Cole Porter and George Gershwin, who were composers, and that's what they did. And there were people who were lyric writers, and that's what they did. And there were singers like Frank Sinatra who just sang, and they didn't write their own material. Everybody now is a composer. Everybody writes their own songs, which is fine. But it just means that the actual volume of them is now in the trillions, I should think. And so how we, and if indeed we should, preserve all of those treasures is another matter. The things, history has a way of sifting out, you know, the good. At the time of Beethoven, there were a lot of composers who were significantly more famous than he was. One was called Meyerbeer. You know, what happened to Meyerbeer? You know, not much. So history has a way of filtering out the dross. And a thing like Tipperary still seems to have as much life in it now as it had 100 years ago. I don't know, John might have a different kind of focus, but I suspect it'll just work itself out, I think. I'm waiting for the days when the music is put into the glasses digitally. So when I'm accompanying my students at school, I just program number 44 and the music just comes in front of them. I think it's not far away. We've got the Google glasses are here, aren't they? Yeah.
Well, and folk music's survived, hasn't it? As a musical form, it's, well, I suppose a lot of musical forms have, but John himself, I suppose, is the you know, channels the music and is part of a group of people who helps revive it every few years. We talked earlier about the popularity of bush bands back in the 70s and 80s, and that's died down a bit. You believe there'll be a resurgence, and with music like that, of course it will.
Well, the popularity of different styles of music definitely goes in waves. I know a lot of people in Brisbane who benefited from the enormous interest in Irish music that was around, you know, Irish pubs when that great wave came through, and you know, that was a lovely thing if that's how you're making your living. But in terms of music surviving, and folk is about music surviving and changing, there's no one time when all the music was real and happened. It was being added to then. I mean, the reference back to Tipperary. That's a song that was picked up and became part of this amorphous thing that is folk. Talking about what Robert mentioned earlier, I didn't quite get the title of the song you were talking about. I murdered my mother with a meat axe.
Yes.
I think it was.
What was that?
Chopping up grandma. Well, I was speaking to one of the students at school about some song that I was working on. I said, it was a blues from 1933, original, and it's called I'm a Rattlesnake and Daddy. And he wanted to play the blues. I said, I don't think you should see the lyrics of this one. He said, that's nothing. So he said, you should hear what's on the radio. So, you know, I mean, that particular song. But what my feeling is that the more we write and the more we do, the more we find there are certain ways that work, certain things that work. I've got 4 boys at school now in year 12, and all they want to play is the blues. They obviously in year 12 they don't want to do classical piano, but they're really starting to get so interested in the way the blues evolved, not just from the call and response songs of the African Americans in the cotton fields and all those kinds of things, but even further back, how did it work in Africa? What did it do? And then listening to and I pointed out to them that most of those early blues piano players couldn't read music at all. They only learnt by just imitating other people. So those traditions, and apparently at the time of Scott Joplin, the ragtime, apart from a very few musicians like Joseph Lamb and Scott Joplin, who could read music, 90% of them couldn't. Irving Berlin couldn't read music, and he wrote over 800 songs, only which 799 were hits, you know, and he couldn't read a note. So I think that music has this strange animal that doesn't really exist unless you play it or sing it. That music on the table is just kind of sitting there. And that's what it'll do. It won't do anything else unless we, you know, do something with it. The wonder of digital music, the boys all use Sibelius 7 at school, their composition, push the button, it plays instantly. You know? So I think the game plan has changed. The rules of the game have changed. But I think it's the same game. You know?
But I'm a firm believer in the idea that songs get to be old if they have some quality about them. The real rubbish doesn't survive.
No.
I mean, it might survive in records as a matter of interest, but it doesn't survive in people's singing. It doesn't survive in people's performance. A song has to have some quality about it to survive, and that brings to mind another something that Martin Carthy, the English singer and collector, once said. He said that the only way to damage a song is to not sing it. So people take old music and they make new things with it. That lets the old song live. One of the dangers in having an interest in folk music, you'll come across the idea that the important thing is to sing the song the way the 90-year-old man sings it on the wax cylinder. That's not going to help that song survive. If you take that song and sing it in a way that doesn't put all this dross between the audience and the song, you help the audience hear the song. That gives the song the best chance it has to survive.
But John has brought along tonight something quite special, which is, I suppose, the musical equivalent of a 90-year-old man, and he has a concertina here that is very valuable and very special. It's from the 1890s, is that right, John?
Yeah, this one's probably 1895, and it was in Australia at least, in Newcastle, part of a Salvation Army band.
Is that right?
Yeah, this is a Wheatstone baritone. So it's the
1890s.
The range of a cello, and it's one of a pair. The other of the pair is a bass, which has the same range as a C extension double bass. So that's a low note on this. The pair of this one has a range that's an octave lower. So this is the baby. They're the same size. An instrument made from the early 19th century in England. Somehow, these pair of concertinas, which were made and sold together as a pair, came out to Australia, and someone in the 70s bought them from a woman in Newcastle who had them in boxes in a garage.
And the condition is incredible.
Oh, this one's in pretty good nick, and it's.
Can you play a bit?
Sure. And, forgive me, but it's played like this. This is I'll just sing you one verse. It's a song from a poem by John Patrick O'Brien. He wrote it, I think, in round about 1920, called The Riderless Horse. And I put this tune to it just to give you an idea of the sort of thing you can do with an old poem, turning it into a song. He comes when the gullies are wrapped in the gloaming, and limelights are trained on the tops of the gums, to stand by the slip rails awaiting the homing of one who marched off to the beat of the drums. So handsome he looks in his puttees and khaki, light-hearted he went like a youngster to play. But why comes he never to speak to his darkie around at the rails at the close of the day? See, that's taking an old poem, putting it with an invented melody, and playing it on an instrument that predates the song, the poem, by 30 years. But you put it together in a way that means that an audience in 2014 can sit here and get some idea of the sense of the message that this person was trying to send in 1920. That's about surviving.
It is, but it needs people like you, John, doesn't it, to help it survive. But you know, as Robert said, the information's all there. It's just waiting for people to come and revive it, isn't it? And that's the importance of the library.
You can never deny that some of what musicians do with old music is the product of our taste. It's our choices, and so then you have, of course, had the defence position of, if you don't like it, well, make your own choices.
Is there something in our DNA where culturally that certain music does trigger something visceral?
Oh, I think so. It's hard not to feel something if you have certain experiences of growing up in Australia when you hear the melody of Waltzing Matilda. It's unlikely to be genetic, but it's certainly cultural.
Is a comment appropriate?
Yes, no, look, go for your life. Yep.
Look, I can't help thinking that the songs you've version of What If We Have a Jesus, When There's Blinking Waters Over.
When There's Blinking Waters
Those
Over.
songs
Yeah.
were written by the soldiers at the front, and and I'm just trying to reinforce what's being said, really. But let's hope you've got a bright song you can play for us.
A
bright
song.
A happy song. From another period, obviously. Maybe not the the 20s, the 40s.
Oh, yeah. This is a song around 1870. It's a song called Brewing, and it's a song written about the circumstance of having a public house out in the bush somewhere, and you run out of beer. So it well predates the pub with no beer. And the publican's job in these circumstances is to make something that he can sell as beer. It needs to be intoxicating and hopefully not deadly. But he doesn't want to use grain because grain's too expensive. So that's his job. I'll just do a little bit of it. But the tune is pretty much the original tune. Changed it slightly and changed the sense of it. It's a very weird old song, but it works with contemporary audiences. Come all you wealthy brewers that make colonial ale, let us mix now the concoction that has such a ready sale. Come hither with your drugs, hops and barley are too dear. We'll mix the swipers up a dose of pure colonial beer. First fill the vat with water, put some molasses in. With vitriol and opium we may just as well begin. Put in there some chamomile, it's a wholesome thing I hear, and will counteract the tobacco that we now put in the beer. It's the brewing of the beer, the brewing of the beer. Success to all your chemistry, the art of brewing beer. I guess that's an example of taking an old song and changing it.
And there's a big drinking culture, of course, but never more so probably than in the late 19th century.
Oh yeah, the thing about that song, of course, you can usually tell the story with it of how home brewing was made illegal after the failure of the conscription referenda in World War I, because a lot of the opposition to conscription was the Irish Catholic community, who were also the big home brewers.
Mm-hmm.
And the legal bans on home brewing weren't lifted until 1972 when Lionel Murphy became Attorney General.
Is that right? Does anybody else have another question? Yes, over there. Do we have the microphone? Yes.
Talking before about folk music and when it becomes folk music, when will something like Lennon and McCartney become folk music? Is it going to be 100 years or another 50 years?
I'd say it is. I would say Lennon and McCartney stuff. If a group of people get together in Australia at a party and sing a Beatles song and they feel better because they're singing it together, then it's a folk song.
That's a great definition of a folk song, isn't it?
In the same way that in the world of folk, if someone says that's not folk, it usually means I don't like it.
So he's a singing student. Oh, I want to learn that new Michael Bublé song, All the Things You Are.
Yeah.
I said it's 1928. No, it just came out on the last album. It's new. No, I said it's 1928. Oh, no, it's new. You see, so everything old is new again, one way or another. And the good things do manage to survive. And it takes performance, I think, and it takes platforms, it takes repositories, it takes places like museums and libraries to say it's here if you want to do it, it's available. That's why I think, and I'd like to finish with a story not about libraries but about librarians, because I know there are a couple here, and to talk about sometimes the serendipity of all this whole process. You know? So I come here quite often, and I order the materials that I want to look at, and I sit there and I sift through them, and I find something astonishing. So happened in 1973 when I was a postgraduate student living in Helsinki, Finland, in my government-provided accommodation, very Scandinavian sort of free living, style. We have 4 apartments on the corner of a square with 1 communal living room and 1 front door. And one Saturday morning, the doorbell rang, and I went out and I saw a very distinguished-looking elderly lady there, and she asked for one of the other people who lived in the quadrangle, who happened to be a librarian from Poland. And she came to Helsinki, Finland to learn about librarians. I don't quite know how a Polish person learns about libraries from Finland, but that's the case. And I knew the girl had gone out because I saw her go, and I said to her, she's not here. Oh, she said, she's going home to Poland next week, and I'm the chief librarian of the library where she's working, and I brought her a gift which I want her to take home to Poland. I said, well, you can leave it here, and I'll make sure she gets it. So I gave her my name, and she gave me her name, which turned out to be Mrs. Vegelius, like Sibelius, Mrs. Vegelius. And I said, you don't mean Vegelius as in the man who taught Sibelius? Oh, yes, she said, my husband's great-great-grandfather. Oh, I said, I'm happening to be studying Sibelius. Oh, how interesting. She said, have you been to the Sibelius home where he grew up in the country? Oh, no, I said, I haven't been there. Oh, she said, I'll bring my car on Monday and we'll go and we'll have a picnic. So it's very generous. So Monday she drives up and off we go. We drive about 100 miles out into the Finnish countryside where Sibelius has lived. And Sibelius' father died when he was about 7 of typhoid. He was a military doctor and he was tending to the soldiers and he caught the typhus vaccine disease from them. So Mrs. Sibelius packed up her 3 children and took them to live with grandmother, in the countryside. And this is where we went to look at this house, which is now owned by a Finnish bank, and it's got a preservation order on it, and it's like a little museum. So we go into the museum, and they've produced a little booklet on the history of the house. And I'm reading through it, and there was a little map inside that say, the Sibeliuses lived here, Mrs. Smith lived there, Mrs. Jones, except Mrs. Jones had a Finnish-sounding name, Punki Kali or something, and they lived here. And suddenly there was a house name, and it said, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so lived here. And I said, that is not possible, because in the research we were doing in the manuscripts of Sibelius, there were certain family names that came up that we couldn't trace. And suddenly we found that they were neighbours of the Sibelius family in that area and never been heard of again. They weren't poets or writers, they were just neighbours. And so they would have evenings undoubtedly around the piano and they would do things and write things. So that through this wonderful librarian and the total serendipity of the librarian she came to visit not being home and me giving her name and she giving me her name, we discovered a whole bunch more about the documents in the Finnish National Library which we were trying to study. So you have to have the people just as you have to have the documents. The manuscripts are no good much by themselves. You have to have somebody to interact with them and to help those manuscripts come to another life or to find what their specific gravity is. You know, if they are dross, then they'll go out. If there's by some miracle there's something. There's a document here that I found a couple of months ago, a 200-page plus handwritten diary from World War I. By an Aussie Queensland soldier, a bookkeeper. He had been a bookkeeper in Brisbane. He was age 43 when he enlisted. 200 pages. Some of them couldn't even get paper. They wrote on matchboxes. They wrote on anything they could. This man managed 200 plus pages. And he did that because whenever he was sent to England on bivouac, they stayed at wherever they stayed, he'd go into the writing room and steal all the writing paper. And then he'd write these long letters to his mother and then post them in England so they escaped the censor. And he'd say to Mum, Mum, this is instalment 4, save this one. Instalment 5 will follow in 3 months when I get more. And 200 plus pages of that diary are here in a box which nobody knew was there because it wasn't supposed to be there.
Wow.
So until people come in and interact with the documents, nothing happens. And it's the same with the music on the table, you know. Beautiful, beautiful Queensland is not a gem, but down on the sands at Emu Park, it could live again. Michael Bublé may record it, you see.
It
you
will
never
happen.
know.
Thank you, Robert. And John, we'll thank
finished.
Robert and John now, but we'll go over here in a second.
We'll look.
And have a look at the material. And
Thanks, John.
a conversation when we've got the material in front of us is always interesting. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.